A few weeks ago, I did a video on table saw safety. In case you missed it, I'll leave the link right there. I know there are hundreds, probably even thousands of table saw safety videos on YouTube, but mine was a little bit different. My video was from the perspective of a trauma surgeon who actually took care of people who had suffered injuries from table saws. One of my viewers left a comment suggesting that I do a video on first aid tips. I thought that was actually a really good idea. Sure, it's great to know how to avoid injuries, but what happens if you actually get an injury? I'm not talking about table saw injuries. If that happens, you go to the hospital. But what about all of the other minor injuries in the shop? What do you do to treat those? Well, that's what I'm going to go over in this video. As a preface, I am probably obligated to say that nothing that I say in this video should be taken as medical advice. If you have a serious injury, you should consult a doctor. Now, with that out of the way, let's get started. The first thing that I'll talk about is equipment that you should have in your shop, which is a first aid kit. There are lots of different first aid kits available online. I've seen a lot in the $20 to $40 range, and they have hundreds of items in them, from roll gauze to sterile gauze to alcohol swabs and iodine and all kinds of various lotions and potions. And I will tell you that you won't need most of them. The only things that I have in my first aid kit are gauze, Band-Aids, and Neosporin. That's it. The reason for that is if I have an injury that requires equipment more serious than that, I'm not going to treat myself at home. I'm just going to go to the hospital. And I'm a trauma surgeon. I've treated thousands and thousands of wounds. So if I'm not treating myself at home, neither should you. If you're wondering what kind of gauze and what kind of bandages to get, it really doesn't matter. They're all about the same. The gauze size, again, doesn't really matter because if it's a big wound, you're not going to treat that at home. You're going to go to the hospital. And the brand of the bandage doesn't matter either. As long as it's sterile, just get whatever's cheapest. They're all the same. As for antibiotic ointment, I will sometimes use it, sometimes not. Depends on how dirty the wound is. And that leads me to my second first aid tip. What do you do with a wound once you get it? Step one, stop using the tool. If it's a power tool, turn it off. If it's a hand tool, put it down. That may seem obvious, but sometimes in the moment you kind of get lost and forget to put it down, and you can actually re-injure yourself or make your injury worse. Step two, if you're bleeding, grab whatever you have that's closest to stop the bleeding. That might be a paper towel, that might be a shirt, it might be a clean rag. Don't use a dirty rag. Also, don't use a tissue or toilet paper. Those can actually get stuck in the wound. I'll just use this abrasion on my finger as an example. I got this a couple of days ago. All I did is I grabbed a clean paper towel, and you just hold direct digital pressure directly on the wound. Don't ball it up and put it on like this. All that's doing is distributing the pressure over a much larger area. You want to put all of the pressure, as much as you can, directly where the bleeding is. If you can't find anything else to use, it's okay to use your shirt. If you're worried about getting blood on it, don't be, because peroxide will actually get it out in the wash very easily. And speaking of peroxide, I'll talk about that a little later on. Step three, go to the bathroom and wash your wound out with soap and water. If you're wondering what kind of soap, it doesn't matter. You don't have to use antibacterial soap. You don't have to use wound cleansers. You don't have to use sterile saline or sterile water. Just soap and water. Any kind of soap and water. Just make sure you wash it thoroughly. Once the wound is clean, dry it off. If it's still bleeding, continue to hold pressure. Hold it for 5 minutes. Don't look at it. Don't let the pressure up. Hold it for 5 minutes. And by the end of that 5 minutes, most likely it will have stopped bleeding. If it hasn't, hold for another 5 minutes. As a vascular surgeon who trained me once said, all bleeding stops eventually. Kind of a dark joke, but I still think it's funny. Step four, once the wound has stopped bleeding, cover it. Don't go and buy expensive gauze and medical tape. I promise you it is not any better than just a regular Band-Aid. If you'd like to put some triple antibiotic ointment on the wound, now would be the time. It's important to keep wounds moist for them to heal properly. If you've ever heard the old line, oh, just let it air out and dry and that way it'll heal, that's not true. I used to think that way also before I actually was trained in wound care. I ran a wound clinic for a half a day once a week for about 3 years, and I learned a ton about wound healing. Wounds need to stay moist in order to heal. Usually, if you are using a Band-Aid, that will trap enough moisture in the wound to keep it moist enough. But if not, you can use some triple antibiotic ointment. It's not so much the triple antibiotic that's doing the heavy lifting, it's the ointment, so you can just use regular old Vaseline. My next first aid tip, this isn't really in my first aid kit, but in my junk drawer here, I keep a pair of fine tweezers. These are excellent at getting splinters out, which I get all the time. I got this on AliExpress for about $1 or $2. Next, what do you do to put a bandage on your fingertip? You can't just wrap it around because it just won't stay. Well, all you'll need is a bandage and a pair of scissors. Take the bandage, cut 2 slits along the length of either side, wrap one of the tails diagonally across your fingertip, and then the other one diagonally the other way, and take the other 2 tails and wrap them around both sides. And those bandages can be replaced as often as you need to. Now, if you're wondering about a painless way to remove a bandage, it's very simple. Just soak it in some warm water for a few minutes, and that should soften the glue enough so that it'll come right off. But if you're really hairy, it's probably still going to pull your hair. Sorry. Now, fingers are not the only thing that can get injured in the shop. So the next thing I'm going to talk about are your eyes. Of course, we all are wearing safety goggles and face shields all the time, right? So this shouldn't be an issue most of the time. Occasionally, however, a piece of sawdust or something will still find its way in there. So what do? This one is pretty simple. Unless you happen to have an eye wash station in your house, you just flush it out with some warm water. Unless you're a contortionist and can get your head under the faucet, the easiest way to do that is in the shower. Just run some warm water, hold your eye open as best you can, and try to flush it out. If you flush it out and it still hurts, well, there are 2 possibilities. Number 1, it could be that the fragment is still in there. Or number 2, it could be that you have a corneal abrasion. That's a fine scratch on the outer surface of your eyeball. Those will normally heal by themselves without any intervention, but if it's still hurting, there's no way for you to know if you got all the sawdust out. So I would absolutely suggest going to see an eye doctor. They can take a look and make sure that you flushed out all of the particles and then prescribe you some eye drops if you need them. That happened to me once early in my woodworking hobby before I regularly wore safety goggles. I went to see an ophthalmologist and she said I had 6 fragments of wood still sitting in my eye. She got those all out, prescribed me some antibiotic drops, and they all healed up just fine. But I waited almost a week before going to see her. Don't do that. Don't be stupid like me. Just go see somebody. Now, you may be wondering about contusions or bruises. What should you put on a bruise? What should you do to a bruise? The answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing. A bruise is nothing more than bleeding in the subcutaneous tissue. That blood in there has to go somewhere. So what has to happen is it has to get broken down, and then your body has to reabsorb all of those blood products. That process takes about 2 weeks. There are several products on the market like Arnica that are designed supposedly or sold to help with bruises. They don't work. Since the blood is underneath the skin, nothing that you put on the skin is really going to help. So don't worry about it. Just leave it alone. It'll go away in a couple of weeks. Next, I promised I'd get back to hydrogen peroxide, so here we go. I used to use hydrogen peroxide a lot when I was a kid. Any cut I would get, I would put peroxide on it. It bubbles and it stings and it makes you kind of feel like you're doing something good because it's killing stuff in there, right? Well, yes, actually it is. Hydrogen peroxide is outstanding at killing cells like bacteria. Unfortunately, it's also very good at killing your cells, which are infiltrating the wound and trying to start it healing. Peroxide does not increase wound healing, it actually impedes it. So I never use peroxide on wounds, ever. The only thing I ever use peroxide for is on laundry to get out blood stains. If you're looking for an antibiotic preparation to put on a wound, any preparation of povidone iodine is going to work. Iodine has been used for about 100 years in wound care. It has broad spectrum antibiotic potency. It is not known to cause any resistance in bacteria, and it actually does help with wound healing because it can get through what's called a biofilm. A biofilm is kind of a mixture of stuff that can collect on the surface of a wound and prevent it from healing. And unlike other antibiotics, iodine can actually penetrate that biofilm and get to work. One final first aid tip for lacerations that you absolutely did not hear from me and I have never done myself: super glue. Before you think I'm crazy, we actually use cyanoacrylate glue in the operating room. There are 2 different products that I've used, one called Dermabond and one called Surgiseal, that I have used either on top of sutures or instead of sutures to close wounds. Granted, those wounds have been thoroughly cleansed and sterilized, so to speak. You can't really do that at home, so it's not really equivalent. But in a pinch, I have used super glue to temporarily close a laceration until I can get to a sink, get it cleaned with soap and water, and then closed properly. Again, you didn't hear that from me, and I don't recommend you actually do that. I cannot stress enough how important it is to get the wound as clean as possible, get all the particulates out, and hopefully prevent an infection. Next, what to do if you step on a rusty nail. Yes, this is not just a tall tale. Believe it or not, this stuff actually does still happen. It's not just stepping on a rusty nail, it's also puncturing your hand or your knee or something else by a rusty nail or a screw or a staple, especially if you're doing things like working on pallets. So what do? Step 1, apply pressure to stop bleeding. Step 2, wash the wound thoroughly with soap and water. Step 3, apply some antibacterial ointment. Step 4, apply some kind of bandage. And step 5, try to remember when your last tetanus booster was. Yes, tetanus is still a real thing. It's caused by a bacteria. It's not necessarily caused by rust. The bacteria is called Clostridium tetani, and it lives in soil and on rusty nails and screws. The major problem with stepping on a nail is it's a puncture wound which can introduce that bacteria deep into your tissue, making it much harder to clean. You should get a tetanus booster every 10 years if you're an adult. If you can't remember when your last tetanus booster was, it's probably time for you to get one. And if right now you're thinking, well, I've never heard of anybody getting tetanus, yeah, you're right. That's because the vaccine works so well. So make sure yours is up to date. Next, I'm going to talk about something that's hopefully going to be pretty rare in a workshop, which is going to be a chemical burn. If you happen to come into contact with something in the workshop that causes a chemical burn, the first thing you want to do is remove all of the clothing in that area. The chemical can actually get on the clothing, and the clothing can hold that chemical against your skin, which will worsen the burn. The next thing you want to do is flush the area with cool running water for at least 20 minutes. If this is a dry powder like lye, you want to brush as much of it off as you can, because adding water can actually cause a chemical reaction and make the burn worse. After the burn is thoroughly flushed with water, cover it with a sterile gauze dressing. Keep the area elevated if you can. That will help to reduce swelling. Taking something like ibuprofen will also help with swelling as well as with pain. And last but certainly not least, go to the hospital. Don't try to treat a chemical burn by yourself at home. Please seek professional help. One type of injury that I've personally experienced many times in my shop is an abrasion, usually from some kind of sandpaper. A laceration can be closed, but with an abrasion, you've lost a portion of the skin, so that can't be closed. The first step to treating an abrasion is exactly the same as for a laceration, which is wash it with soap and water. Bleeding from an abrasion usually isn't as bad as from a laceration, so if you just apply some pressure for a couple of minutes, that'll usually stop any bleeding. Then you cover the abrasion with some kind of ointment, either antibiotic or iodine. After that, some kind of dressing, either gauze or bandage. It doesn't really matter as long as it's clean, it's covered, and it's moist. My last piece of advice is about major injuries. Now, what constitutes a major injury? Well, I'll liken it to this. If you've ever been in the shop and you kind of start thinking, should I do that? Then you shouldn't do it. This is kind of the same thing. If you have an injury in your workshop and you think, is this a major injury? It very well could be. That's the kind of injury where you should stop immediately, call 911 or 999 or 112, depending on where you live in the world, and go to the hospital. Please go get checked out. It's not worth the risk. If you're worried about being embarrassed by telling the doctor what stupid thing that you did that landed you there, don't worry about it. I promise you that doctor has heard something 10 times as stupid earlier that day. And if you happen to be that doctor's stupid story of the day, well, at least you gave them a good story. Well, I hope you found these tips helpful. If you did, please let me know down in the comments. If you would be so kind, I would very much appreciate it if you would hit the like button and subscribe if you think I've earned it. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you next time.